We are only a few weeks away from getting our hands on the Elden Ring network test, and it feels a little unreal. After years of waiting, speculating, and clawing at scraps of rumors, we are finally going to take our first steps into the lands between. And so, before we cross the Sea of Fog and brandish the Elden Ring, let me refresh your memory of its lore and provide you context of what we're about to experience. I need to note also that in this video we're only going to be discussing the story of the game and not the gameplay itself. We've done tons of videos breaking down what our experience is going to be like, so feel free to check those out. But now, let's delve into the twisted history of Elden Ring. To begin our story of Elden Ring as we know so far, we have to start with our setting, the Lands Between. The Lands Between, formerly known as the Riftlands, was once a perfect world. The depth of this perfection is unknown, yet we have some clues that can assist us in identifying what exactly constituted this so-called perfection. We know that before the Shattering, which we'll talk about later, even wolves dared not roam the lands. And based on simple intuition and observation, we can see that the land is now broken with fractured topography and creatures are warped and twisted. This implies that the perfection of the land did not include such abnormalities, but instead had an orderly constitution in which the land was proper, and so were its inhabitants. We know the Lands Between is made up of several biomes and environments supporting diverse landscapes both low and high. Our travels will take us through autumnal fields and forests, deep into crystalline caves and dank swamps, through Athenaeum castles with dark secrets, and even up to the snowy heights of the world. And these are only the places we've seen, we have hints of others. For example, Vadividya describes seeing a large aquatic expanse of dilapidated ships, which we can assume is going to be a playable area. There is no shortage of beautiful environments in the Lands Between. And at the heart of this world is the Erd Tree, a giant golden tree that casts its golden luminescence across the land. We'll dive into the properties and the mysteries of the Erd Tree later, but for now, keep in mind that the Lands Between bask in the golden grace of the Erd Tree's light. As we know so far, the Lands Between is an isolated location accessed across a sea of fog and a home to many races of inhabitants. These inhabitants, before the Shattering, enjoyed the blessings of the Erd Tree and its golden grace. Now, before we discuss the Erd Tree's components, I would like to also give you insight into the inspiration of the Lands Between, so you can understand it better. The Lands Between appears to be heavily inspired by the land Tirnanog from Celtic mythology. Tirnanog is the home of the Celtic pantheon of gods known as the Tuatha and it's also described as a perfect world of everlasting youth. And what's interesting is that Tirnanog is accessed by crossing a sea of fog on a magic spirit horse. Some legends describe a golden path that guides the rider across the sea of fog. One legend tells about a man named Oshin who was met by a maiden named Neve and gifted the ephemeral steed so that he could access Tirnanog. Now, Tirnanog and the Lands Between are virtually identical in their nature, and definitely worth looking into when we get our hands on the final game, but for now, just keep that legend in the back of your mind. As mentioned before, the Erd Tree is the primary source of magic for the Lands Between, and at the heart of the Erd Tree is the Elden Ring. We don't know much about the Elden Ring itself, except that it is the source of the Erd Tree's power, it is able to be physically shattered, and it's able to be brandished as a weapon even in a fractured form. What we can observe, however, are the effects of the fractured shards of the Elden Ring. These shards, known as the Great Runes, possess a tainted power that manifests itself through different elements depending on the wielder. Currently, we don't have a definite example of these powers, but we can see twisted forms of potential candidates. One such power of the Erd Tree that we know existed before and after the Shattering is the Guidance of Grace. This Guidance of Grace can be observed through a golden glow in the eyes of its chosen, and it's able to be gifted and taken away by its own greater will. We know that the many inhabitants of the Lands Between have experienced this grace, but after the War of the Shattering, the grace left the Lands Between to find the Tarnished across the fog and call them back. And we'll talk more about that later. Fragments of its blessing yet remain in hidden pockets of the Lands Between at sites of lost grace, which are locations and points of interest where the Tarnished can find respite on their journey. Another important note is that we do not know who or what shattered the Elden Ring or even why or how they did it, although we do know that the deed itself was foul. Of the known inhabitants are a slew of animals commonly found elsewhere such as rodents, fauna, and many birds, but after the Shattering, terrible creatures appeared. Dragons, harpies, and blighted minds patrol the fields in search of prey. Twisted forms of once noble rulers reside in 6 capitals across the Lands Between, guarded by even more twisted subjects. The Shattering brought with it a blight that claimed the minds of many, but still residing in the Lands Between are sentient and conscious people. We know practitioners of arcane arts are still able and willing to assist the Tarnished on their journey by teaching them their work. It's an observed practice throughout the Lands Between to wear facial coverings for an unknown reason, although the most likely possibility is to hide a rot that appears to be spreading. We can see traces of this rot on the Valkyrie enemy, and we know it to be affecting our maiden Melina. It's unspecified what the origin of this rot is, but logically it would not have been present before the Shattering. Several races of people can be found in the Lands Between, and we know of two that can be differentiated by hair color. We know of a race of red hairs and white hairs, and according to a leak long ago, these two are at odds, although that's not official just yet. Another race of beings in the Lands Between are wolf people. It's likely these are the wolves that dare not roam, as any loyal wolf will bite at its master's enemies, and they seem to have no place in a perfect world. The political structure of the Lands Between is presumed to be organized as follows. Queen Marika the Eternal is the presiding monarch and the mother of the demigod children who currently reign with the tainted power of the shards of the Elden Ring known as the Great Runes. This ruling authority is called into question, however, when we observe the current situation after the Shattering. We know that this family was once noble and has inhabited the Lands Between for a long time. This changed, though, in a war known as the Shattering. And this is a good place to note that the Shattering refers to the war that took place and not the physical action of shattering the Elden Ring. The war that took place put a curse on the land, and now the demigods squabble over territory, abusing the tainted power of the Great Runes. Currently, besides Queen Marika, we know of two other names of the royal family, King Godfrey and Godrick the Golden. Godrick we know as the big multi-arm boss that we can see in his legacy dungeon known as Stormvale Castle. Godrick's story goes as follows. Born a weakling child, he coveted the strength of his kin. We don't know for sure if he is in possession of a great rune, although we do know that he has the power to grow himself by attaching the limbs of other living creatures, such as arms, legs, and even the head of a wyvern. His residence in Stormvale Castle appears to be under siege by wyverns and dragons. With many soldiers at his command, he is collecting body parts to grow his form, and as of now, that's all we know for certain. As for Queen Marika, we know she's the current ruler of the Lands Between. Many assume she's malevolent in nature, but we have nothing to suggest that she's our main antagonist. The only thing tying her to evil per se is that her children currently possess the Great Runes. She is the current monarch, but the fact that her children squabble and bring ruin to her land seems to insinuate a lack of power over them. Her nickname, the Eternal, is also an enigma at the moment. We don't know for sure if this suggests physical immortality or if it was given to insinuate that her name and legacy of her rule would last forever. We've seen this several times throughout history, so it's not out of the question. We also know that her offspring possess a godship in a form since they are called demigods. This tells us that either she is a god, her spouse was a god, or her children were created through a godship of some kind. But once again, we don't know. Another character that's going to be playing a massive role in our story is Melina. Melina is our ephemeral maiden that assists the Tarnished on our journey. She's an interesting character, shrouded in mystery. We know she's the one to present us with our spectral spirit horse and take us across the fog to the Lands Between. Melina herself possesses a spectral aura since it was said that she manifests herself at sites of lost grace. And we know that she's going to be playing a very important role in the story of Elden Ring, although it may not be all benevolent. Melina has ambitions of her own, a personal reason to help us and a goal unknown to the player. When we first meet her, she gives us an accord, the terms of which we don't know yet. There are many speculative theories surrounding what her motives might be. We don't quite know yet, but feel free to dig around the channel if you want to get into the speculation side. And the final thing we know about her is that she too is affected by this rot. One of her eyes is closed by it. The final and most important aspect of our story is the Tarnished. And surprisingly, they are perhaps the characters we know the least about. The Tarnished were once a race of inhabitants that called the Lands Between their birthright. An unknown event occurred that resulted in the Tarnished being exiled from the Lands Between. It's unspecified when exactly this event occurred, but presumably it was before the Shattering. Although if it was before the Shattering, during the time when the Lands Between was a perfect world, it insinuates that the Tarnished committed an action that resulted in them being exiled. A legend tells that the Tarnished will indeed return to the Lands Between, guided by the greater will, and this is where we find ourselves. The game begins at the point when the Tarnished are called back and receive the grace they lost, and fulfill the legend by seeking the Elden Ring. The theme that the game seeks to explore is this: how should we feel seeing that this land was once ours, and it's since been squandered, polluted, and corrupted, and only now are we, the Tarnished, called to return? The logical conclusion of the game is for the Tarnished to defeat the demigods, claim the Great Runes, and seek the Elden Ring in order to return the Lands Between to its former glory. But as for now, that's where we stand in terms of official lore. We know the game is going to have many more dark secrets for us to uncover. And as always with FromSoftware games, we know the ending is not going to be that straightforward. At this point, I have so many more questions I want to get the answers to, and hopefully in the network test, we can find out even more about the lore of the game. But until we get our hands on it, and if we're lucky enough, this is the current context that we have going forward. But anyways guys, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're excited for Elden Ring, leave a like on it, and do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with all the latest Elden Ring news. And with that guys, I'll catch you in the network test.